At my retirement party, while every surgeon I had ever trained raised their glasses to 40 years of saving lives, my 17-year-old grandson slipped a folded piece of paper into my jacket pocket. I did not read it until I was alone in the parking garage. 6 words. "They are going to take everything, Grandpa." I did not call anyone. I did not confront my son. I drove home, locked the door, and opened the one room in my house that nobody knew existed. What I set in motion over the next 72 hours would bring my own family to its knees. But I need to go back. Not to the beginning, because the beginning is something I did not understand until much later. I need to go back to the night that note was written, and the silence that preceded it, and the particular kind of stillness that settles over a house when the person who made it a home has been gone long enough for the walls to forget her voice. The fact that you are here means something to me. Before we continue, tell me in the comments what city or country you are watching from. Let us make this feel like a room full of people who understand that family is the most complicated surgery any of us will ever perform. One note worth mentioning. This story contains fictional elements crafted for educational and emotional depth. Names, characters, and locations are invented, but the message behind them is one worth holding close. Because the things that happen in families, the betrayals, and the forgiveness, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding, those are as real as anything I ever encountered in an operating room. My name is Dr. Henry Morrison. Most people who knew me called me Hank. I was 69 years old, retired from the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery at the Medical University of South Carolina after 40 years of practice. I had performed 4,217 open-heart surgeries in my career. I remembered the first one with the precision of a man who understands that some moments define every moment that follows. I remembered the last one the same way. I lived alone in a house on Magnolia Street in Charleston, South Carolina. A modest house by the standards of the neighborhood. 2 stories. White clapboard siding, a porch that needed repainting, and a garden that my wife Ruth had planted the spring before her diagnosis. She had died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis arrived on a Tuesday. She was gone by December. 11 weeks between the first scan and the last breath, and every one of those weeks I held her hand and felt it grow lighter. And there was nothing my training could do about any of it. The house still smelled like her jasmine in the evenings when the humidity rose. I had not changed that. I would not change it. From the outside, I was exactly what the neighborhood assumed. A retired surgeon living on his pension, keeping his garden alive, walking to the harbor on Sunday mornings to drink coffee and read the paper. A quiet man in a quiet house at the quiet end of a career that had once meant something. That version of me was useful. It was also incomplete. I drove home from the retirement party at 9:14 in the evening, parked in the driveway, and entered through the side door, which I always used because it was closer to the room that mattered. I did not stop in the kitchen. I did not pour the glass of bourbon I usually poured after social obligations that required me to perform a version of myself I had long since outgrown. I walked directly to the end of the hallway, past Ruth's photograph on the bookshelf, past the guest bedroom door, and into what anyone visiting my home would have reasonably assumed was a small private medical office. It had been that once. When Ruth was alive, I had used it to review case files and consult with colleagues after hours. The examination table was still there. Pushed against the far wall, the medical reference volumes still lined the shelves. But behind the bookcase on the east wall, accessible only by a recessed latch I had installed myself during the renovation in 2019, was a second room. The monitors came to life. 3 screens arranged on a repurposed surgical instrument table. The primary display showed my patent portfolio. 8 active patents for cardiac surgical instruments I had designed and refined over 3 decades. Combined annual royalties, $600,000. The 3 largest, a self-adjusting valve retractor, an arterial microclamp, and a thermal adaptive suture guide, generated $420,000 of that total. All 3 were scheduled to expire on March 15th of next year. I had decided 4 months ago not to renew them. The second screen displayed the current projections for MedPioneer Incorporated, a medical device company I had co-founded and quietly funded in 2012 with $300,000 of personal capital, routed through a holding structure that carried no public trace of my name. My equity position was 20%. The acquisition by a major medical conglomerate was scheduled for June. Conservative valuation placed my stake at $35 million. My son Nathan had never been told. There had been a time when I considered telling him. That time had passed. The third screen displayed the irrevocable trust I had established in March, 7 months earlier, when the early signs of what Nathan and his wife were building had become something I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. Oliver Morrison, my grandson, sole beneficiary. $400,000 in initial funding, with future royalties from the 5 patents I intended to retain flowing into it until he reached 21. The trustee was a corporate fiduciary firm with no family connection, no court order, no power of attorney. No conservatorship arrangement could redirect its operation. Only Oliver, upon turning 21, would have access. The documentation was precise. The instrument was sealed. I reached into my vest pocket and removed Ruth's watch. A pocket watch she had given me on our wedding day, 41 years ago. The engraving on the inside of the case read, "Steady hands, steady heart." I had carried it into every surgery I had ever performed. Every single one. I held it now under the desk lamp and looked at the face, worn smooth along the edges where my thumb had rubbed it thousands of times before making the first incision. "They are coming," I said to the room. Ruth did not answer. She had not answered for 3 years. But I had learned during those years that speaking aloud to her was less about expecting a response and more about keeping myself accountable. A surgeon who operates without a witness makes mistakes he never catches. I needed her in the room. Even if the room was the only place she still existed. I set the watch beside the keyboard and opened the email that had arrived 4 days before the retirement party. The one that had confirmed everything the note in my pocket was now telling me a second time. 68 days remained before the 3 primary patents expired. Whatever was coming would arrive long before that. I had performed over 4,000 surgeries in my career. Every one of them required knowing exactly when to cut. This time, the operation was on my own family. And the first incision had already been planned. But first, I need to take you back. 4 days before that parking garage. 4 days before the note. To the version of my life that still looked, from every observable angle, like the quiet retirement of a man who had earned it. Tuesday morning, October the 8th. I woke at 5:15. The same time I had been waking every morning for 40 years. Because the body of a surgeon does not forget its rhythms. Simply because someone has told it, the work is finished. The bedroom was still dark. The space beside me was still empty. 3 years, and I had not moved to the center of the mattress. I slept on my side, the left side, because Ruth had always slept on the right, and there are habits that outlast the reasons they were formed. I made tea, not coffee. Ruth had converted me to tea during her final months, when coffee became one of the many things her body could no longer tolerate. I had continued drinking it after she was gone. Not because I preferred it, but because the ritual of preparing it. The kettle, the particular cup she had chosen, the 2 minutes of standing at the counter, while the water worked toward boiling, was the closest thing I had to her company at that hour. The kitchen was sparse but functional. A single framed photograph on the counter beside the stove. Ruth at 59, standing in the garden with soil on her gloves and jasmine cuttings in her hands, caught in the kind of laughter that only happens when someone is not aware they are being photographed. Everything else in this house served a purpose. That photograph was the only thing in it that served as meaning. By 6:30, I had walked the garden. Ruth's jasmine along the back fence had entered its autumn rest, the blooms gone but the roots holding firm beneath the soil. I checked the moisture, adjusted the mulch, and stood for a moment looking at the plant the way a surgeon looks at a patient in stable condition. Present. Attentive. Not intervening. The rest of the morning unfolded as mornings always did. Medical journals. Emails from former colleagues. Lunch assembled with mechanical efficiency. An afternoon walk to the harbor. The same bench, the same thermos of tea. The same cargo ships moving through the channel with the slow inevitability of things that cannot be redirected once set in motion. This was the life they saw. This was the version of me that Nathan and Isabel had constructed in their understanding. A retired surgeon on pension income. A house worth perhaps $400,000 on the Charleston market. A man whose most valuable remaining asset was a garden planted by a dead woman. They were not entirely wrong. They were simply incomplete. And incomplete information, in medicine and in strategy, produces catastrophic miscalculations. The email arrived at 8:15 that evening. I was in the study, the front room, not the room behind the bookcase, when my laptop produced the notification I had assigned to a single sender, Thomas Whitaker, my accountant for 22 years. A man who delivered financial information the way a surgeon delivers a diagnosis. Clearly, completely, and without embellishment. The subject line read, "Urgent, unusual inquiry pattern detected. Dr. Morrison. Over the past 6 weeks, I have identified a pattern of unusually specific inquiries into your financial architecture. The questions are targeted. Asset structure. Patent ownership chains, trust instrument filings, corporate equity positions. Someone with legal training is investigating your financial holdings with a level of specificity consistent with preliminary conservatorship research. I recommend we discuss this at your earliest convenience. Discretion is essential." I read it twice. The second reading is always the one that matters. I was not surprised. Surprise requires the absence of anticipation. And I had been anticipating this since July, when Nathan's questions about my health had shifted from general to specific in ways a father notices and a surgeon categorizes. "How is your memory, Dad? Are you sleeping well? Have you thought about seeing someone? Just to make sure everything is tracking?" Those questions had not been concern. They had been reconnaissance. Someone was mapping what I owned, preparing to argue that I was no longer competent to manage it. I looked at the clock. 8:47. I picked up the phone and called Victoria Chen. She answered before the second ring. Victoria had been my attorney for 25 years. She understood the architecture of my financial life better than anyone alive, because she had helped me build it. And because Ruth had insisted, years before any of this became necessary, that I needed someone whose loyalty was professional rather than personal. "Victoria," I said, "I need you to activate the contingency protocol. Everything. Tonight." A pause on the line. The kind that carries weight because the person on the other end understands exactly what the words mean. "The full contingency," she said. "All of it. As quickly as legally possible." Another pause. Shorter. Then, "Hank, is this about Nathan?" "It is about everything that matters," I said. "I will explain once you have the framework in place." "I will begin at 7 tomorrow morning," she said. The line went quiet. I walked to the bookshelf and picked up Ruth's photograph, soil on her gloves, jasmine in her hands. Ruth had made me say the words aloud to her twice, on a night in the hospital when the morphine had made her honest and the prognosis had made me desperate. She had held my hand with the strength that dying people sometimes find when they need to deliver one final instruction. "Promise me, Hank. Not the money. The people. Say it again, so I know you mean it." I had said it again. I had meant it then. I meant it now. I set the photograph back on the shelf and stood in the hallway outside the door to the room behind the bookcase. I did not go in. That room and everything it contained would be necessary soon enough. But tonight, the night the email confirmed what I had been dreading, and the contingency was set in motion, and the ground beneath my family began shifting in ways none of them would feel for weeks, Tonight, I simply stood in the hallway and listened to the quiet. Ruth's jasmine was resting in the garden outside. The roots were holding. The season was turning. And a man who had spent 40 years knowing exactly when to operate had just received the signal that the patient was ready. The preparation was complete. The team was being assembled. The only question remaining was whether the people I loved would survive what was coming, or whether the damage had already gone too deep for any instrument I possessed to reach. Charleston Memorial Hospital had reserved the Harborview Ballroom for the occasion. 200 guests, 40 years of cardiac surgery compressed into a single evening of champagne, careful speeches, and the particular kind of institutional gratitude that organizations perform when they are simultaneously honoring a career and closing the file on it. I arrived at precisely 6 o'clock, the way I had arrived at every surgery for 4 decades. Punctuality is not a habit for me. It is a diagnostic tool. The people who arrive early are anxious. The people who arrive late want you to know they have somewhere more important to be. The people who arrive on time are paying attention. I was paying attention. Nathan met me at the entrance to the ballroom. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly pension, which I noted without commenting on because commenting would have served no strategic purpose. The hug lasted 1.5 seconds. I counted, because I always count. A surgeon who cannot measure time instinctively is a surgeon who loses patience during the critical seconds when measurement is the difference between tissue that heals and tissue that dies. Good to see you, Dad. He said it with the warmth of a man who has practiced warmth. You look good. How are the hands? The hands. Not how are you, not how is the house, not how is the garden Ruth planted. The hands. Because the hands were the variable he needed to monitor. The hands were the data point that would determine whether the plan he and Isabel had been constructing for months would proceed on schedule or require adjustment. They are what they are, I said. 69 years old and retired. They do not need to be anything else. He smiled. Listen, most of the guests tonight are hospital board members, department heads, a few donors from the foundation. You do not need to deal with all of that. There is a quieter area near the back bar. Isabel, thought you might be more comfortable there. What he said was, you do not need to bother with these people. What he meant was, these people should not have to see you as anything other than the version I have described to them, the elderly father, the pension surgeon, the man whose relevance ended when his hospital privileges did. Of course, I said, and walked toward the back of the room. I was 69 years old. I held 8 active patents, generating $600,000 annually. I owned 20% of a company, preparing for a $35 million acquisition. And my son had just directed me to the quiet section of my own retirement party, the way a hospital administrator directs a confused patient to the waiting room. I sat at a small table near the service entrance and watched the evening through a doorway I had not been invited to cross. The ballroom had been arranged for impression. Flowers selected for photography, lighting calibrated to flatter. A projected slideshow of my career running on a loop behind the podium that no one was watching because the people in that room had come for the networking, not the nostalgia. The kitchen area where I had been stationed was where the event actually operated. Servers moving trays. A caterer arguing with someone about the dessert timeline. A water stain on the ceiling tile that maintenance had not addressed. The gap between what a room performs and what it truly is can tell you most of what you need to know about the people who arranged it. Isabel appeared at 7:15. She moved through the ballroom with the fluid efficiency of a woman who understood exactly how much space she occupied and had calculated its value. She was 40 years old, French by birth, raised in Marseille until her 20s, and carried an accent she deployed strategically. Soft when she wanted something to sound intimate, crisp when she wanted something to sound authoritative. Tonight it was crisp. She stopped near a cluster of board members within clear earshot of my table. This was not accidental. In the 3 years I had observed Isabel Fontaine Morrison, nothing she did was ever accidental. Have you noticed his hands lately? She said it to a woman I did not recognize, leaning forward at the angle people use when they want a conversation to carry without appearing to project it. They shake when he holds his glass. 40 years of surgery, and now he cannot manage a champagne flute. You know how it is with these old physicians. They never know when the curtain has come down. Light laughter. The polite, uncommitted kind that people offer when they want to participate in a cruelty without accepting responsibility for it. She caught my eye across the space and arranged her expression into something resembling concern. "Oh, Henry, I did not see you there. How are you feeling tonight? You look tired. Are you getting enough rest?" The words were structured as consideration. The delivery was a public audition for the role of concerned daughter-in-law, performed specifically for the board members standing within evaluation distance. She was building a narrative: the frail father-in-law, the worried family, the responsible children who were already considering options for his care. "I am fine," I said. "Thank you for asking." She held my gaze for one additional second before turning back to her audience. That second was the actual message. It said, "I see you, and I have already decided what you are." Nathan was standing at the far end of the room during this exchange. He had heard it. I watched his face for the particular micro-expression that would tell me whether he recognized what his wife was doing. His face produced nothing. Not agreement. Not objection. The neutral stillness of a man who had decided months ago which side of the room he was on and was now simply executing the position. At 7:45, Nathan had gathered a group of donors near the harbor windows and was explaining a new investment fund with the confidence of someone who had recently acquired information and mistaken it for expertise. He glanced at me mid-sentence. "My father is brilliant in his field, truly. But modern asset management is not exactly his territory." He smiled the way people smile when they are delivering an insult inside a compliment and expecting the packaging to conceal the contents. Different generation. One of the donors attempted a polite recovery. "Well, 40 years of cardiac surgery speaks for itself." "Sure," Nathan said, and moved on. What he needed the room to believe was simple. His father was a man of a previous era, credentialed but limited, respected but diminished, not someone whose awareness extended beyond the boundaries of the operating room he had already left. I understood why that narrative was useful to him. Understanding it did not make it easier to sit through. I remained at my table near the service entrance and watched the evening continue around me. 200 people celebrating a career. Not one of them, apart from the 17-year-old boy I had not yet seen that evening, understood that the man they were honoring was conducting the most important observation of his professional life. Every glance Isabel directed at the board members. I observed everything. I recorded everything. And I said nothing. Because some diagnoses are better kept in the chart until the surgical team is fully assembled and the operating room is prepared. Oliver found me at 8:15. He was carrying a plate of food he had assembled himself. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, a piece of bread torn rather than sliced. The kind of plate a person makes when they are paying attention to what someone needs rather than what the catering menu offers. He set it in front of me without ceremony or explanation, pulled a second chair to my small table near the service entrance, and sat down across from me. We did not speak for several minutes. We did not need to. There are people in a life who understand that presence is its own language, that sitting beside someone in a room where they have been made to feel invisible is an act more articulate than any sentence. Ruth had possessed that quality. It was the thing that had made her not just a surgical nurse but the best surgical nurse I had ever worked with. She could stand beside me for 9 hours in an operating room and communicate everything necessary through timing, through anticipation, through the steadiness of her hands next to mine. Oliver had inherited that quality. Not through genetics, because he carried none of Ruth's blood, but through proximity, through years of sitting in this exact kind of silence with a grandmother who had taught him, without ever saying it directly, that the most important thing you can offer someone is the knowledge that they are not alone. He was 17 years old, thin in the way that teenage boys are thin before their bodies decide what shape they intend to become. He wore a jacket that did not quite fit his shoulders, borrowed or outgrown, and his hair needed cutting in the particular way that indicated he had more pressing things on his mind than maintenance. His eyes were older than his face. I had noticed that about him for several years. The eyes of a boy who was processing more than he was saying. "Thank you for being here, grandfather," he said quietly when I set down my fork. "Thank you for remembering I was here," I replied. He looked at me with the particular expression he sometimes carried, the one that told me he was holding something behind his teeth, measuring it, deciding whether the moment was right to release it. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. Then he nodded once and returned to watching the room. I ate the food he had brought. It was the only thing anyone had offered me all evening that had not been designed to diminish me. At 8:30, I stood to use the restroom and walked through the hallway that connected the ballroom to the hospital's administrative wing. The hallway was dimly lit, carpeted, lined with framed photographs of former department chairs going back to 1942. My own photograph was fourth from the end. I did not look at it. Nathan was standing near the coat closet at the far end of the corridor, phone to his ear, voice low and controlled, shaped into the particular register that people use when they believe they are alone and are saying things they would not say otherwise. "The neurologist appointment is set for Tuesday," he was saying. "Once we have the cognitive evaluation on file, we can move on the petition. The attorney says the timeline is aggressive but achievable if we get the documentation submitted before he realizes what is happening. The key is speed." The old man cannot know. He looked up. He saw me. The call ended. His phone went into his pocket with the controlled efficiency of a man who has practiced concealment. Neither of us acknowledged what had just occurred. 3 seconds passed in that hallway. 3 seconds during which my son looked at me, and I looked at my son, and the distance between us became something neither of us would be able to measure in feet or years, or any other unit that the world uses to describe the space between people. He turned and walked back to his guests. I remained in the hallway for a moment longer, standing beneath the framed photographs of the men who had led this department before me, and I thought about the fact that Nathan had not even bothered to lower his voice. That was the detail that confirmed it. Not the words themselves, which I had expected. Not the plan, which Whitaker's email had already identified. But the volume. He had spoken at the volume of a man who genuinely believed his father was not sharp enough to understand what he was hearing. That assumption would cost him everything. I left the party at 9 o'clock. The goodbye was procedural. Nathan offered a hug that lasted 1.1 seconds. Isabel waved from across the ballroom without interrupting her conversation. 200 people continued celebrating a career that the guest of honor had already been dismissed from. Oliver walked me to the door. He had not been asked to. He had simply appeared at the threshold, the way Ruth used to appear at moments when her presence was needed, but had not been requested. At the doorway, he leaned close. His voice dropped below the noise of the room, steady, deliberate, and carrying the weight of something he had been holding alone for longer than a 17-year-old should carry anything. "Do not read it here," he said, as I felt the paper slide into my jacket pocket. "And grandfather." He paused. "It is worse than you think. I need to show you something soon." I looked at him. I nodded once. I walked to my car. I did not read the note in the ballroom. I did not read it in the hospital lobby or the elevator or the corridor leading to the parking garage. I read it standing beside my car on the 3rd level of the garage, under fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency I associated with late-night operating rooms and the particular loneliness of decisions made after midnight. 6 words in Oliver's careful handwriting. "They are going to take everything, Grandpa." I folded the paper and placed it back in my pocket, beside Ruth's watch. On the drive home through Charleston, past the lit buildings of the medical university, past the research pavilion, where I had spent the better part of 4 decades developing instruments that kept hearts beating in chests that would otherwise have gone still. I thought about something Ruth had said the first time Isabel came to our house for dinner. It was 11 years ago. Ruth had watched the younger woman move through our living room and said afterward, quietly, while we were alone in the kitchen washing dishes, "That woman holds her wine glass like she is studying you through it." Nobody watches their father-in-law that carefully without a reason, Hank. I had told Ruth she was being suspicious. She had set down the dish she was drying and looked at me with the particular patience she reserved for moments when I was being deliberately obtuse. "I am not suspicious," she had said. "I am precise. There is a difference. And that woman is carrying something toward you. I can see it in the way she holds herself when you speak." I had dismissed it. I had attributed it to the protective instinct of a wife who felt her son had chosen someone she could not read. I had been wrong in a way that had cost us years. Ruth was never suspicious. She was simply earlier than the rest of us. The front door closed behind me at 10:12. I stood in the hallway of my house on Magnolia Street with a note in one pocket and a pocket watch in the other, and I understood with complete clarity that the next phase of my life had begun. The rain arrived before Oliver did. A steady October rain that settled over Charleston without announcement. I had been awake since 5. Standing at the kitchen counter with tea I had not particularly wanted, when I heard his key in the lock at 8 o'clock. He had a key. Ruth had given it to him 4 years ago, the same week she was diagnosed. Pressing it into his hand with the quiet authority of a woman already organizing the world she was about to leave. "Keep this," she had told him. "Your grandfather will need someone who does not knock." Oliver came through the door carrying 2 coffees from the place on King Street and a laptop bag over one shoulder. He was wearing yesterday's clothes. His hands were steady. His eyes carried the weight of someone who has been holding a secret alone for longer than was comfortable. He set the coffees on the table, opened the laptop, and looked at me directly. "I need to show you something, grandfather." Not a request. A statement. I sat down across from him and said nothing. A surgeon learns that the most important thing you can do when someone is about to deliver difficult information is to make the room safe enough for them to finish. "I started documenting in February," Oliver said. He turned the laptop toward me. A spreadsheet filled the screen. Dates in the left column, descriptions in the center, file references on the right. 8 months of entries organized with a precision I recognized as his own native habit of mind. The same instinct Ruth had carried her entire life. "But first," he said, "there is something you need to know about me." He paused. The rain moved against the kitchen window. "I speak French. Fluently. I have been teaching myself for 3 years. Online courses, conversation groups, everything I could find. I started because I wanted to understand where my mother came from, her culture, her language." He looked at me steadily. "She does not know I understand her. And for the past 8 months, every conversation she has had in French, every discussion she believed was private because she assumed nobody in the house could follow it, I have heard and recorded." He opened an audio file dated February the 12th. Kitchen acoustics. A house that believed it was alone. Isabel's voice came first. French. Oliver translated in real time, his voice controlled. The voice of a boy who had listened to his mother plan the disassembly of his family in a language she believed was her private fortress. "Once the conservatorship is granted, the patents transfer immediately. The old man's house alone is worth more than my father ever had. Nathan does not understand half of what his father owns. That is what makes this work." A second voice. Male. Calm. "And after?" Isabel again. Without hesitation. "Marseille. The accounts are ready. Nathan gets nothing. The boy stays behind. Once the money is secure, it does not matter who has him." Oliver paused the recording. He did not flinch. He had listened to his mother refer to him as the boy who could be left behind, and he had sat with that knowledge for 8 months rather than react, because he understood that reaction without evidence is noise. "I have 47 recordings," he said. 8 months of material. Every significant conversation documented. He moved through the evidence. Bank statements photographed from Isabel's laptop, deposit patterns in accounts Nathan did not know existed, amounts calculated just under federal reporting thresholds, a name repeated in the French conversations. Lucien, someone in Marseille. Someone waiting. Then he opened a separate folder. These are documents Dad has been having me sign. His voice shifted, more careful now. They were mixed in with school permission slips and athletic consent forms, things a 17-year-old does not read carefully because he trusts his father. He turned the screen toward me. But these 3 are not routine. When filed, they create a legal pathway for Dad to access accounts held in my name. He paused. I am 17, grandfather. He is using me as a financial instrument. I did not understand what I was signing until I went back and read everything. The rain was louder now. The kitchen held only that sound and the hum of the laptop and the presence of a boy who had conducted an 8-month counterintelligence operation against his own parents using a language they did not know he spoke. Grandfather. Oliver's voice changed again. More deliberate. I need you to understand something. I did not do this because I am particularly smart, or because I had a strategy. I did this because I love you, and because you taught me what a steady hand means. Not just in surgery, in everything. You taught me that the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same, and that the difference between them is what defines a person. He paused. I was not going to let them take you apart without you knowing. For the first time since the retirement party, the composure I had maintained developed a fracture. Not grief. Recognition. Ruth had lived in this quality. The capacity for love that does not calculate its cost before deciding to act. Oliver had inherited it through years of proximity to a woman who embodied it. I reached across the table and held his hand. No words. Some things communicate more clearly without them. After a moment, he continued. I do not know what you are planning, but I know you are planning something. Whatever you decide, you are not alone. I have independent documentation. You have backup. He opened a final file. 2 encrypted USB drives. Storage locations. Backup protocols. 1 copy in his possession. 1 stored at a location not connected to his name. If anything happens to either copy, the other survives. This is not just information, grandfather. It is insurance. I pulled him into an embrace. Over his shoulder, through the kitchen window, the rain moved through Ruth's garden in steady sheets. She had always said the people worth keeping were the ones who showed up before you knew you needed them. Oliver had shown up 8 months before I understood that I did. When he stepped back, I made 1 phone call. Victoria answered on the first ring. We have independent corroboration, I told her. My grandson has been documenting since February. 47 recorded conversations in French. Financial records. Signed authorization forms. Whatever we build from here, we are not building it alone. A pause. Then, that changes the architecture considerably. Proceed accordingly, I said. I stood at the kitchen window watching the rain. 2 independent investigations. 2 people who had, without coordinating, arrived at the same conclusion, through different paths. Oliver had done in 8 months what I had spent years preparing for. He had simply loved someone enough to act before he was asked. The operating team was assembling, and the people across town who believed they were planning in private had no idea that their private language had been understood by the 1 person in the house they had dismissed as irrelevant. Nathan arrived at my house on the evening of October the 22nd, carrying a manila envelope and the particular manner of a man executing a plan he believed was already complete. He was more focused than he had been at the retirement party. Less performance, more precision. Whatever hesitation he might once have had about what he was doing had been resolved somewhere between then and now. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, set the envelope in front of me, and slid out a document that ran to 13 pages. It is a standard health insurance upgrade, he said. Long-term care provisions, emergency coverage extensions. The kind of thing you should have had updated years ago. Honestly, Dad, I need you to sign it. For everyone's peace of mind. I did not respond to the words. I responded to the architecture behind them. The document looked legitimate at surface level. Health insurance language filled the first 8 pages with the dense, unremarkable weight of genuine policy documentation. Technical terms arranged in sequences that a layperson would scan and a professional would recognize as functional. It was well constructed. Someone with legal training had assembled it carefully, and I noted that the craftsmanship was several levels above what Nathan was capable of producing on his own. Isabel's hand was in this document the way a surgeon's hand is in a procedure, present in every precise detail, even when someone else appears to be leading. But on page 9, buried in a subsection titled Medical and Financial Coordination Provisions, was language granting Nathan comprehensive legal authority over my financial accounts, property holdings, and asset management decisions. The clause was written in the particular style of legal prose designed to be technically accurate while remaining functionally invisible to anyone reading quickly or without training. Victoria had obtained a copy of this document 5 days ago through her network. I had been expecting this visit since Monday. I picked up the pages and made a show of reading slowly. I held them at arm's length, the way a person does when their eyesight has deteriorated, and they have not yet accepted the need for stronger glasses. I squinted at the smaller print. I turned pages with the deliberate pace of someone who is working through material that challenges their processing speed. I let my hand tremble. Not dramatically. Not enough to appear performed. Just enough. A slight unsteadiness in the fingers holding the paper. The kind of tremor that a son who has already decided his father is declining would see and file as confirmation rather than examine as evidence. I had practiced this. 3 evenings alone in the kitchen, holding documents at various distances, calibrating the degree of visible difficulty to the precise level that would satisfy observation without triggering suspicion. 40 years of cardiac surgery teaches you many things about hands. One of them is that the difference between a hand that trembles from neurological decline and a hand that trembles from performance is invisible to anyone who is not a specialist. Nathan was not a specialist. He was a cosmetic surgeon who operated on people who were awake and paying for the privilege. He had not held a dying heart in his hands since his 3rd year of residency, and even then, I suspect he had found the experience inconvenient rather than instructive. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Nathan pointed. "Page 9. That line there. That is the only one that matters." I reached for the ceramic cup of pens on the counter. Then I paused. I looked at the document again. Squinting, I read the critical sentence on page 9 aloud, slowly, the way a person does when they need to hear the words to understand them. This provision grants the designated party authority to manage financial accounts and property holdings on behalf of the undersigned. Nathan shifted in his chair. "It is procedural, Dad. Needed for emergency medical situations, so decisions can be made quickly if you are ever incapacitated." I nodded slowly. I picked up the pen, and I signed. Henry J. Morrison, not Henry K. Morrison. J, not K. A single letter. The middle initial on my birth certificate. My medical license, my patent filings. Every legal document I had signed in 69 years of life was K. Kenneth, after my father. The signature I had just placed on Nathan's document carried the wrong initial. It was clean, legible, confident, and entirely convincing to anyone who was not comparing it against official records. It was also, upon filing, legally void. Nathan pulled the document toward himself immediately. He examined the signature. He checked it twice. It was clear. It was where it should be. It looked exactly like what he had come here. He slid everything back into the envelope and stood up. "Thank you, Dad. This is genuinely helpful." He placed his hand on my shoulder for 1.3 seconds, a gesture calibrated to communicate filial care in the time it took him to confirm that the document was secure. He was out the door within 4 minutes. He did not look back. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the taillights of his car disappear down Magnolia Street. Then I held my right hand in front of me in the light from the window, perfectly still, steady as it had been. The morning I performed my first solo bypass, at 31 years old. Steady as it had been the afternoon, I removed a tumor from a 7-year-old girl's pulmonary artery while her parents waited in a hallway and prayed to a God they were not certain was listening. Steady as it had been every day of my professional life. Because a surgeon whose hands are not steady is a surgeon who kills people, and I had not killed a patient on the operating table in 4,217 procedures. I wrote a single line on the notepad beside the fruit bowl. October 22nd, 7:45 in the evening. Signature legally void. Middle, initial, incorrect. Document worthless upon filing. Then I called Victoria. Phase 1 is complete, I told her. The document is in his possession. We will see when he moves. I will monitor through my contacts at his attorney's office, she said. My estimate is, he submits it Monday morning. I thanked her and ended the call. The kitchen was quiet. The camera system in the home clinic had recorded the entire visit. Audio, video, timestamp, Nathan's voice explaining that the document was a health insurance update, my voice reading the critical clause aloud, his hand pointing to the signature line. Every element preserved, encrypted, and backed up to a server that no one in my family knew existed. I walked to the bookshelf and looked at Ruth's photograph. She was laughing in the garden, soil on her gloves, jasmine in her hands. The first incision has been made, I said to her. He will not feel it for 72 hours. And by the time he does, the second one will already be in progress. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment. Not from exhaustion. From the particular stillness that follows a procedure, executed exactly as planned. The trembling had stopped because it had never been real. The signature was on the page because it was designed to fail. And my son was driving home with 13 pages of worthless paper and the absolute certainty that his father was losing his mind. That certainty was the most valuable thing I had given him all evening. Victoria called on Monday morning at 10:47. She had been monitoring Nathan's attorney through her professional network, the kind of quiet, procedural observation that lawyers conduct when they need to know what the other side is doing without announcing that they are watching. He filed it, she said. 10:15 this morning. His attorney submitted the document to the appropriate office for processing. Standard procedure for a financial authority designation. I waited. Victoria was not a person who called to deliver incomplete information. It was rejected, she continued. The signature reads, Henry J. Morrison. The legal records on file, your birth certificate, medical license, patent filings, all of them carry the middle initial K. The reviewing clerk flagged the discrepancy within 40 minutes. The document has been returned with a notation. Signature does not match records on file. Resubmission required with corrected documentation. I said nothing for a moment. I looked at the kitchen window where the October light was coming through at the angle it always did this time of year. His attorney, Victoria added, is apparently not returning his calls. I understand there was a rather uncomfortable conversation at the filing office in which the attorney was asked to verify the signature and could not explain the discrepancy. That kind of professional embarrassment tends to create distance. I allowed myself a small, precise measure of satisfaction. Not pleasure. Satisfaction. The distinction matters. Pleasure is emotional. Satisfaction is the recognition that a mechanism has performed exactly as designed. Nathan would be confused. He would assume the pen had malfunctioned, or that I had made an error, or that the filing office had applied an incorrect standard. He would not consider, because he was not capable of considering, that his father had signed the wrong initial deliberately. That possibility existed outside the boundaries of the version of me he had constructed, the trembling, squinting, declining old man who needed help reading the fine print. The first trap had worked. He would spend the next several days trying to understand what had gone wrong. And while he was spending those days in confusion, The second trap was already moving into position. Caduceus Recovery LLC was registered in Delaware on November the 15th. Victoria had handled the formation through a corporate services firm that specialized in legitimate debt acquisition entities. The company carried a registered address in Wilmington, operational bank accounts, proper licensing for debt collection activity in the relevant jurisdictions, and no publicly traceable connection to my name. I had chosen the name deliberately. The caduceus is the ancient symbol of medicine. Two serpents wrapped around a winged staff. It is the emblem that appears on hospital doors and ambulance panels and the badges of physicians across the world. My son would receive a demand letter from a company named after the symbol of the profession that connected us, and he would not recognize the reference. That irony was not accidental. Over the following 3 weeks, Caduceus Recovery, operating through legitimate debt broker intermediaries, acquired Nathan's outstanding obligations from their original creditors. The portfolio was substantial: $420,000 in malpractice settlement debts from 3 separate lawsuits that his Miami practice had lost or settled unfavorably, $160,000 in credit card balances accumulated across 6 accounts, $120,000 from an unsecured personal loan taken to cover operating costs at the practice during a period when patient volume had declined. Total outstanding obligations: $700,000. Acquisition cost to me, at standard distressed debt discount rates, $520,000. In exchange, I had become my son's primary creditor while remaining entirely invisible to him. The demand letter went out on the morning of January the 2nd, year 2. Registered mail. Delivery confirmation. Formal legal letterhead. Full outstanding balance of $700,000. 10 business days to respond with payment arrangements or documentation of dispute. Victoria called that afternoon. He received it this morning, she said. I understand he has spent the past 4 hours making phone calls. His original creditors confirmed the transfers were legal and properly documented. He searched for Caduceus Recovery through every channel available. State business registries, commercial background services, bar association referrals. He found a properly registered Delaware LLC with a legitimate operating address and no ownership information beyond the corporate structure. She paused. He found nothing that should not be there, because nothing that should not be there exists. Over the following 3 days, the pattern unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. Nathan called his bank. He called his mortgage servicer. He consulted 2 separate attorneys, neither of whom could identify who controlled Caduceus or offer a strategy for negotiating with an entity that had no public face. On January the 5th, Caduceus filed for a civil judgment in the appropriate jurisdiction, the procedurally correct step following non-response to a formal demand. The filing appeared in public court records. Nathan's mortgage servicer received formal notice of the pending claim, which triggered a review clause in his practice loan agreement. The financial ground beneath my son was shifting in 4 directions simultaneously, and he could not identify the source of any of them. Victoria called me on the evening of January the 7th with the information I had been waiting for. His wife has been consulting with attorneys separately, she said. Isabel is pushing to accelerate the conservatorship petition timeline. Originally, they were planning to file in late February. She is now arguing for mid-January. She wants the petition active before whatever Caduceus is doing creates additional complications. I set down my tea. She is not panicking, I said. She is calculating, Victoria replied, which in her case tends to produce the same observable behavior. She was right. Isabel did not panic. She recalibrated. The danger was not that she would make emotional mistakes. The danger was that her recalibration would outpace my timeline. But I had planned for speed. I had planned for exactly this acceleration. Because a surgeon who cannot adapt when the vital signs change mid-operation does not survive his first year in the specialty. I had been adapting for 40. That evening I sat in the room behind the bookcase and reviewed the full operational status of what I had built. 2 traps activated. The signature, void, and rejected. The debt acquisition. Compressing Nathan's financial options from every direction. Isabel was accelerating directly into the architecture I had designed for exactly this purpose. She believed she was responding to an external threat. She was, in fact, responding to a mechanism I had constructed specifically to produce the response she was now producing. I looked at Ruth's photograph on the wall. Not the one in the kitchen. The second one, taken 12 years ago in the surgical suite at Charleston Memorial, the day we performed our last operation together. She was in scrubs, mask pulled down around her chin, and she was smiling at something I had said that I could no longer remember. "Two down," I said to her. "And the one that matters most has not even started yet." The monitors hummed. Outside, January had settled over Charleston with the particular cold that meant the year was turning. Somewhere across the city, a woman who had spent 14 years building toward this winter was accelerating her timeline because she believed the pressure was external. She had not yet discovered that the pressure was coming from inside her own family's architecture. And by the time she did, the third trap would already be in motion. I have performed surgery on hearts that weighed less than a pound, held together by tissue thinner than newsprint. I have sutured vessels no wider than a pencil lead while a monitor beeped the difference between life and death. None of that required the particular brand of patience I needed the morning I sat across from Raymond Gaines. Raymond ran a debt purchasing firm out of a narrow office on Meeting Street, 3 blocks from the harbor. The sign on the door read Gaines Recovery Solutions. The carpet smelled of instant coffee and old paper. A South Carolina Gamecocks pennant hung crooked behind his desk, and the fluorescent light above us flickered every 9 seconds. I counted. Victoria Chen had found Raymond through her network of financial attorneys. He was not the largest buyer in the secondary debt market, but he was quiet, precise, and discreet. 3 qualities I valued more than scale. She sat beside me in a wooden chair that creaked each time she shifted. A leather portfolio on her lap containing every document we needed. "Let me make sure I understand," Raymond said, leaning back. He was a thick man, mid-50s, with reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "You want to purchase the outstanding debts of your own son." "Not directly," Victoria said before I could answer. "Dr. Morrison's interests will be represented through Caduceus Recovery LLC, a Delaware limited liability company established 3 weeks ago. The purchasing entity and Dr. Morrison share no publicly visible connection. I am the registered agent. The operating agreement is sealed." Raymond removed his glasses, cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, and put them back. "What debts are we talking about?" I opened the folder Thomas Whitaker had prepared. Inside were 14 pages of documentation, each one a small window into the life my son had been living, while telling me everything was fine. First, 3 outstanding casino markers from 2 different establishments, one in Atlantic City, 2 online platforms registered in Malta, combined face value, $212,000. Nathan had been gambling since at least 2019, according to the transaction records Oliver's evidence corroborated. The markers had been sold twice already on the secondary market. Their current purchase price discounted to approximately 60 cents on the dollar. Second, credit card debt across 4 accounts, totaling $109,000. 2 cards were maxed. One had been in collections for 11 months. The fourth carried a balance just under its limit, with minimum payments consistently late by 15 to 22 days. Third, a personal loan of $78,000 from a regional lender, originally taken to renovate the house on Trad Street, the house I had helped Nathan buy. The loan was 60 days past due. A default notice had already been issued. Total face value, $309,000. Raymond whistled, low and slow. "Your son owes nearly $400,000. My son owes what he owes," I said. "I am interested in what it costs me to own that obligation." Victoria slid a single sheet across the desk. "Our offer, $273,000 for the full portfolio. Wire transfer, 48-hour closing." Raymond studied the number. He pulled a calculator from his drawer, an actual calculator, not a phone, and tapped the keys. I watched his lips move as he ran the percentages. 68 cents on the dollar, roughly. For debt that had already been marked down, resold, and was aging toward write-off territory, it was generous. He knew it. We knew it. You understand, he said carefully. Once Caduceus Recovery owns these debts, you can pursue collection, demand letters, wage garnishment, judgment liens, the whole toolbox. We understand, Victoria said. And the debtor your son, he won't know who's behind the curtain. Not until we decide otherwise, I said. Raymond looked at me for a long time. I recognized the expression. I had seen it on the faces of families in the surgical waiting room. The look of someone trying to determine whether the person in front of them was acting out of love or vengeance. I let him look. I had nothing to hide. This was neither love nor vengeance. This was preparation. He signed the letter of intent at 10:47 a.m. Victoria notarized the transfer agreement on the spot. I authorized the wire from Caduceus Recovery's escrow account funds I had moved from a brokerage position 3 weeks earlier. Well before any conservatorship filing could freeze my personal assets. The transaction would settle within 2 business days. Walking back to the car, I felt the weight of what I had just done settle into my ribs like a dull ache after a long procedure. I had bought my own son's failures. Every bad bet, every maxed card, every late payment. They belonged to me now. Filed in a manila folder inside a leather briefcase, carried by an attorney who walked 1 step ahead of me on the wet sidewalk. Victoria paused at the car door. You know what comes next. Demand letters, I said. Certified mail. Return receipt. 30-day response window. The amount? I had calculated it the night before, sitting in the hidden office with Ruth's watch ticking on the desk. Principal plus accrued interest, plus late fees, plus administrative costs assigned under the original lending agreements. $461,000. Victoria wrote the number in her notebook without flinching. She had seen worse. And if he doesn't respond within 30 days, we file for civil judgment. Then we wait. She nodded. He'll panic. He'll go to Isabel. Yes. And Isabel will accelerate the conservatorship timeline. Yes. Which is what you want. I did not answer immediately. A seagull cried somewhere above the harbor. The air smelled of salt and rain. I thought of Nathan at 7 years old, standing on a step stool beside me in the kitchen, cracking eggs into a bowl with the serious concentration of a child who wanted desperately to do something right. What I want, I said quietly, is for my son to have no place left to hide. Not from his creditors, not from his wife, and not from himself. Victoria closed her notebook. We drove back to Magnolia Street in silence. That evening I updated the board in the hidden office. A red marker line connected Caduceus Recovery to Nathan's debt portfolio. Another line, still dotted, pointed toward the conservatorship filing I expected within 3 weeks. A third line green traced the path from Med Pioneer's acquisition timeline to the trust account that would, if everything held, secure Oliver's future regardless of what happened to the rest of us. I set Ruth's watch on the desk. 45 days until the patents expired. The demand letters would arrive at Nathan's door in 7. I turned off the light and climbed the stairs. Each step memorized by decades of habit. In the hallway, I paused at the photograph of Ruth holding newborn Nathan, her smile wide and unguarded. I'm not destroying him, I told her quietly. I'm removing every wall he's built so he has to stand in the open. The house answered with silence, the way it always did. I went to bed. A demand letter is not a scalpel. It does not cut cleanly. It lands on a doorstep in a white envelope with a certified mail sticker and a return receipt card. And it sits there until someone picks it up, signs for it, and opens it in a kitchen or a hallway or a car wherever people go when they sense bad news arriving in paper form. There is no anesthesia. There is no prep. The wound begins the moment the eyes reach the first paragraph. Nathan signed for the letter on a Tuesday at 4:17 p.m. I know this because Victoria Chen received the return receipt confirmation electronically at 4:22, and she forwarded it to me with a single line. Delivered. Clock starts now. I did not call my son. I did not drive to Trad Street. I sat in my kitchen on Magnolia Street and drank a cup of Earl Grey that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. And I waited the way I had waited 1,000 times, outside operating rooms, not for the result, but for the reaction. It came faster than I expected. At 6:03 p.m., Oliver texted me from his bedroom. 3 words. Dad is screaming. At 6:11, a second message. Mom took the letter. They're in the study. Door locked. At 6:34. Mom just made a phone call. Spoke French. She sounded angry, but controlled. She said the word accélère 3 times. Accelerate. I translated it in my head before Oliver's next message confirmed the same. Isabelle Fontainier Morrison, who had spent 4 years laying the groundwork for a conservatorship that would hand her legal authority over every asset I had built in 40 years of medicine, had just received an unexpected variable. She was not the kind of woman who panicked. She was the kind who recalculated. I called Victoria at 7. He'll call a lawyer, she said. Probably tomorrow morning. Any competent attorney will tell him the debt is valid. The purchase was legal. And the 30-day window is real. And Isabelle? Isabelle will do exactly what we projected. She'll push the conservatorship filing forward. She needs control of your assets before a civil judgment attaches to Nathan. If Caduceus Recovery obtains a judgment lien, it could complicate any property transfers she's engineering through the conservatorship. How soon? 2 weeks. Maybe less. She'll need a cooperating physician to sign the competency evaluation. That's her bottleneck. I thought about that word bottleneck and almost smiled. In surgery, a bottleneck is a narrowing of flow. Blood cannot pass. Pressure builds. The tissue downstream begins to starve. Isabelle needed a doctor willing to declare me mentally unfit. That doctor would have to examine me, review my records, and sign an affidavit under oath. It was not impossible. But it was a narrow opening. And narrow openings could be closed. Jim Beckett, I said. Is he monitoring? Daily. No new SEC filings related to Med Pioneer. The acquisition timeline holds due diligence phase through February. Regulatory review March through May. Closing expected June. Your equity position is untouched. Good. And the trust? Oliver's trust is irrevocable. Even a conservator cannot access it. The corporate fiduciary confirmed last week the structure holds under South Carolina law and federal precedent. I exhaled. Outside the window, the garden had gone dark. November in Charleston does not announce itself with snow or bitter wind. It arrives quietly. The way a low-grade fever does a cooling you feel in the bones before you see it in the trees. The roses Ruth had planted along the fence were still holding their last blooms, defiant against the shorter days. There's one more thing, Victoria said. Thomas Whitaker flagged a new inquiry. Someone accessed Nathan's credit report through a monitoring service registered to an address in Marseille. Marseille. The city Oliver's recordings had mentioned 17 times. The city where Isabelle's contact the man Oliver, identified only by the name Lucien, maintained whatever infrastructure Isabelle intended to use once the American assets were liquidated. They're checking the damage, I said. They're checking whether the debt acquisition changes their timeline. It does. Lucien will advise her to move faster. Then we need Jim's analysis by Friday. Already requested. He's pulling transaction patterns from the last 6 months. If there's a wire to Marseille, he'll find it. We hung up. I rinsed my teacup. Dried it with the cloth that hung from the oven. Handle the same cloth Ruth had bought at a farmer's market in 2009, faded now to a color that no longer had a name, and placed it back in the cabinet. Oliver called at 9. His voice was steady, but I could hear the thinness beneath it. The way you hear a slight irregularity and a heartbeat that most people would miss. Dad hasn't come out of the study, he said. Mom left the house at 8. She took her passport. Her passport. I saw it in her hand when she went through the hallway. She had a carry-on bag. I closed my eyes. Isabel was not running. Running would mean leaving the assets behind. She was positioning. A trip to Marseille quick. 48 hours at most to coordinate with Lucien. Restructure the offshore pathway, and return before the conservatorship filing required her physical presence in South Carolina. Oliver, listen carefully. Do not confront your father. Do not mention the letter. Go to school tomorrow as normal. If your mother is not home by Thursday evening, text me the word lighthouse. Lighthouse, he repeated. And Oliver, are you safe? A pause. 3 seconds. In an operating room, 3 seconds of silence. After a question means the answer is complicated. He hasn't touched me, Grandpa. He sat on the kitchen floor after Mom left. He was holding the letter. He looked small. I gripped the edge of the counter. My son, 43 years old, sitting on a kitchen floor holding a piece of paper that told him his debts were owned by a stranger. Except the stranger was his father, and the father was standing 7 miles away, listening through a 17-year boy who should never have been placed in this position. He made choices, Oliver. And those choices have consequences that are arriving now. That does not make him small. It makes him human. I know. Get some sleep. You too, Grandpa. I did not sleep. I went downstairs to the hidden office and updated the board. The dotted line pointing to the conservatorship filing was no longer dotted. I drew it solid red and wrote beside it, 2 weeks, maybe less. Below that, in smaller letters, Isabel Marseille, passport, carry-on. Ruth's watch read 11:47. 38 days until the patents expired. The letter had landed. The reaction had begun, and somewhere over the Atlantic, a woman who believed she controlled every variable in this equation was flying toward a city where she would plan the final stage of a theft she did not yet know had already failed. I picked up my pen and wrote one line in the margin of the board. The patient is responding to treatment. Every surgeon knows there is a moment during a complex procedure when the real threat reveals itself. Not the obvious blockage, not the visible tear, but the secondary lesion hiding behind the first. The one that only appears after you have committed to the incision. Isabel's secondary lesion arrived on a Wednesday morning, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a monogrammed briefcase. His name was Dr. Alan Prescott. I learned of his involvement from Jim Beckett, who called at 7:15 a.m. while I was standing in my garden, holding a pair of pruning shears Ruth had bought in 2006. Jim's voice had the flat precision of a man who had spent 31 years at the SEC reading documents that other people hoped would never be read. Isabel retained a neuropsychologist, Jim said. Name is Alan Prescott. Practice in Mount Pleasant. Board certified. Published. Reasonably well regarded. He filed a scheduling request with the Charleston County Probate Court yesterday afternoon for a capacity evaluation of one Henry K. Morrison. I set the shears on the garden bench. The roses beside me were bare now, stripped by the first real cold front of November. Only the thorns remained. How fast? The court granted an expedited hearing. Evaluation is set for December 9th. That gives you 12 days. 12 days. In surgical terms, that was both an eternity and a blink. Enough time to prepare if you knew what was coming. Not enough if you were caught off guard. I was not caught off guard. What do we know about Prescott? I asked. Jim had already built the file. Alan Prescott, 58. Georgetown undergraduate. Doctoral degree from Emory. Private practice since 2004. He specialized in geriatric cognitive assessments, the kind of evaluations that determined whether elderly patients could manage their own finances, make medical decisions, or live independently. His testimony had appeared in 14 conservatorship cases across South Carolina in the last decade. In 11 of those cases, the court had ruled in favor of the petitioner. 11 out of 14, I repeated. He's effective. His reports are thorough. His courtroom demeanor is calm, and judges trust him. He's not a hired gun in the obvious sense. He doesn't fabricate results. But he has a pattern. He tends to find what the retaining party hopes he'll find. Confirmation bias dressed in a white coat. Exactly. And Isabel is paying his full rate. $12,000 for the evaluation plus testimony. I walked inside, poured coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the garden bench where Ruth and I had spent hundreds of evenings watching the light change over the rooftops. She would have handled this differently. She would have invited Prescott for dinner, poured him wine, and dismantled his assumptions with the kind of warmth that made people forget they were being outmaneuvered. I did not have her gift. I had mine. Jim, I need everything. Publications, prior testimony transcripts, any disciplinary actions, financial disclosures. Can you have it by Friday? Already in progress. But Hank, there's something else. A pause. Jim Beckett did not pause for dramatic effect. He paused when the information required careful delivery. Prescott's office manager made a call on Monday to Charleston Memorial's Medical Records Department. She requested your surgical complication file. My hand tightened around the coffee mug. The surgical complication file was a standard record maintained by every hospital, a log of every adverse outcome, every unexpected event, every case where the result deviated from the expected. For a surgeon with 40 years and over 6,000 procedures, the file was substantial. Not because I had been careless, but because volume produces variance. Every cardiac surgeon who operates long enough accumulates a record that, taken out of context, can be made to look alarming. They're building a narrative, I said. They're building the narrative that your cognitive decline has been gradual and is now affecting your judgment. The complication file gives them historical data points. Prescott will select the ones that support the arc, a steady increase in adverse outcomes over the last 5 years, correlating with age-related decline. Except that's not what the file shows. It doesn't matter what the file shows in full. It matters what Prescott excerpts. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug. The faucet dripped twice after I turned it off a washer I had been meaning to replace for 3 months. A small failure I had chosen to ignore. I would not ignore it any longer. That afternoon, Victoria Chen and I spent 4 hours in her office on Broad Street preparing the counter-strategy. The approach was built on 3 pillars. First, an independent evaluation. Victoria had already contacted Dr. Sandra Okafor, a neuropsychologist at the Medical University of South Carolina, board-certified, published in the same journals as Prescott, and known for meticulous objectivity. She would conduct a full cognitive assessment before Prescott's scheduled date, creating a baseline that any court would have to consider alongside Prescott's findings. Second, the surgical record in context. Victoria subpoenaed my complete surgical file, not the excerpts Prescott's office had requested, but the entire 40-year record, including peer reviews, departmental commendations, outcomes data adjusted for case complexity, and the letter of distinction I had received from the American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons just 18 months ago. Context was the antidote to selective reading. Third, Prescott's own history. If Jim's research revealed any pattern of bias, any disciplinary note, any financial relationship with attorneys who specialized in conservatorship filings, Victoria would enter it into the record, not as an attack, as a question. Your Honor, we simply ask the court to consider Dr. Prescott's prior retention pattern when weighing his conclusions. I left Victoria's office at 6 and drove home through streets that smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter. On Magnolia Street, I parked, walked to the front door, and found a small brown paper bag on the porch. Inside was a jar of honey from the Saturday farmer's market and a handwritten note in Oliver's careful print. For your tea. See you Sunday. Oh. I stood on the porch holding the jar, and for a moment the weight of everything, the debts, the letters, the neuropsychologist, the offshore accounts, the ticking clock receded behind a simpler truth. A boy had walked to a market, bought a jar of honey, and carried it to his grandfather's door because he believed that small kindnesses were worth the effort. Ruth would have said that was the whole point. I went inside, locked the door, and descended to the hidden office. On the board I wrote, Prescott, Deck 9, 12 days. Below it, Okafor evaluation schedule immediately, and in the margin, in green ink, Oliver, honey, still standing, 31 days until the patents expired. The scalpel was getting closer to the bone. I have opened a human chest more than 6,000 times. Each time, the same ritual. Gloves, gown, mask, light, blade. The body on the table does not know whether the surgeon standing above it slept well or argued with his wife or skipped breakfast. The body only knows the cut. And the cut must be perfect, regardless of everything happening outside the sterile field. On December 9th, I was the body on the table. Dr. Alan Prescott's office occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian on Coleman Boulevard in Mount Pleasant. The waiting room had leather chairs, a water cooler with sliced cucumber floating in it, and framed diplomas arranged in descending order of prestige Georgetown at the top, state licensure at the bottom, a calculated display. I noted it the way I would note a patient's skin color before anesthesia. Automatically, without judgment. Filing it for later. His receptionist, a woman in her 40s with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, handed me a clipboard with 14 pages of intake forms. Medical history, medication list, family background, daily routines, self-assessment of memory and cognition. I filled out every line in my steadiest handwriting. I used Ruth's pen, the silver Mont Blanc she had given me on our 30th anniversary, because it wrote cleanly, and because holding it reminded me that precision is not a performance. It is a habit. Prescott came to the waiting room at exactly 10 a.m. He was taller than I expected. 6'2", perhaps 6'3", with a full head of silver hair and a handshake calibrated to project both authority and reassurance. He wore no wedding ring. His shoes were polished but not new. He smelled faintly of sandalwood. "Dr. Morrison," he said. "Thank you for coming in. I know this process can feel uncomfortable. I've spent 40 years making people uncomfortable for their own benefit." I said, "I can tolerate an hour on the receiving end." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that concealed an assessment already in progress, the way he noted my gait as I walked to his office, the steadiness of my hand as I returned the clipboard, the latency between his greeting and my response. Everything was data. I understood this because I had spent my career doing the same thing to patients who did not realize their surgeon was evaluating them from the moment they entered the pre-op room. The evaluation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. He began with the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, a standard screening tool I had administered to my own patients hundreds of times. Draw a clock showing 10 past 11. Name 3 animals. Repeat a sequence of numbers forward and backward. Subtract 7 from 100. Then again. Then again. I completed each task without hesitation. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because my mind worked the way it had always worked. In sequences, in patterns, in the clean architecture of logic, built on decades of practice. Then came the deeper instruments. The Wisconsin Card Sorting Test, measuring cognitive flexibility. The trail-making test, assessing processing speed and executive function. A verbal fluency exercise, name as many words beginning with the letter F as you can in 60 seconds. I produced 20A3. The average for my age group was 12 to 15. Prescott's expression did not change. He wrote notes in a leather-bound journal with a fountain pen, an affectation I recognized as deliberate. He wanted his patients to feel they were being treated with the gravity of handwritten observation rather than typed clinical shorthand. It was effective. I noted it the way I noted everything, without admiration, without contempt, simply as information. The final section was the interview. This was where confirmation bias lived in the open-ended questions, designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted in multiple directions, depending on what the evaluator wanted to find. Dr. Morrison, do you ever forget where you put your keys? Rarely. I keep them on a hook beside the front door. Same hook. For 26 years. Do you sometimes have difficulty finding the right word in conversation? No more than any person who has spent 40 years choosing words carefully in operating rooms where imprecision could cost a life. Have you ever felt confused about the date or the day of the week? Today is Wednesday, December 9th. It is 11:47 a.m. The temperature outside when I arrived was 51 degrees. My appointment was scheduled for 10, and you were punctual. Prescott paused. He looked at me over the top of his journal, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not doubt exactly, but a recalibration. He had expected something different. Perhaps a tremor in the hand. Perhaps a hesitation in recall. Perhaps the kind of quiet confusion that creeps into the pauses between sentences in a mind that is genuinely failing. He found none of it. But I knew because Jim Beckett's file had told me that Prescott's 11 victories in 14 conservatorship cases were not built on fabricated results. They were built on interpretation, on the framing of normal variation as clinical concern, on sentences like "while Dr. Morrison performed within normal limits on most measures." Certain response latencies and pattern recognition scores suggest early-stage executive decline, consistent with his age and reported medical history. Language that sounded reasonable, that a judge without medical training would accept, that turned adequate into ambiguous. I could not control what Prescott wrote, but I could control what existed in the record before his report arrived. 3 days earlier, Dr. Sandra Okafor had conducted her own independent evaluation at Musk. The same instruments, the same interview structure, the same 2-hour window. Her preliminary summary, shared with Victoria Chen under attorney-client preparation, concluded that my cognitive function fell in the 93rd percentile for my age cohort, with no measurable indicators of decline in executive function, memory, processing speed, or verbal fluency. She noted that my trail-making scores were consistent with those of individuals 15 years younger, a finding she attributed to decades of sustained high-complexity professional activity. Okafor's report would arrive at the court before Prescott's. Victoria had timed it precisely. The judge would read Okafor first, and Prescott's conclusions, whatever they were, would land on a mind already holding a contradictory data set. Not proof. Context. The same weapon Isabel had tried to use against me. Redirected. I shook Prescott's hand at the door. His grip lingered half a second longer than the greeting, a tell I recognized from decades of reading patients' families. He was uncertain. Not of his skills. Of his assignment. "Thank you, Dr. Morrison," he said. "Thank you, Dr. Prescott. I trust your findings will reflect what you observed." He said nothing. I walked to my car, sat behind the wheel, and allowed myself 30 seconds of silence. Then, I called Victoria. "It's done. How do you feel?" Like a patient who just woke up from anesthesia and can already feel his fingers. "Okafor's report files tomorrow. Prescott has 10 business days. Then we have 10 days to prepare for the hearing. Hank, you did well." I started the engine. The parking lot smelled of pine mulch and cold asphalt. 19 days until the patents expired. The evaluation was behind me. What lay ahead was the courtroom. And in a courtroom, unlike an operating room, both sides held a blade. I drove home, descended to the hidden office, and marked December 9th with a black circle on the board. Beside it I wrote, "Evaluation complete. Prescott uncertain. Okafor files tomorrow." Ruth's watch ticked on the desk. Steady. Unimpressed. Exactly right. Courtroom 3. B. Of the Charleston County Probate Court. Smelled of lemon polish and recycled air. The ceiling was high, the wood was dark, and the American flag in the corner hung motionless in that particular stillness. that only government buildings achieve, the kind of quiet that exists, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that happens here, permanent. I arrived at 8:45 a.m. Victoria Chen was already seated at the respondent's table, her briefcase open, 4 tabbed binders arranged in a row like surgical instruments on a tray. She wore a charcoal suit and no jewelry except a thin watch. I had learned over the past 2 months that Victoria dressed for courtrooms the way I dressed for operating rooms, nothing that could distract from the work. Across the aisle, Isabel Fontana Morrison sat beside her attorney, a man named Craig Holloway. I had never met Holloway, but Jim Beckett's file described him as a mid-tier family law practitioner who had handled 9 conservatorship cases in the past 5 years, winning 6. He was competent, but not exceptional. Isabel had chosen him, I suspected, because exceptional attorneys ask uncomfortable questions about the motives of their clients. Holloway appeared to be the kind of lawyer who accepted the narrative he was given and built the case around it. Isabel wore cream. Her posture was perfect, her expression calibrated to project the precise mixture of concern and reluctance that a loving daughter-in-law might display when forced regretfully, painfully to ask the court to protect her aging father-in-law from himself. She did not look at me. She looked at the judge's bench with the steady gaze of a woman who had rehearsed this moment. Nathan sat behind her in the gallery. He wore a suit I had bought him for his 35th birthday. It no longer fit well tight across the shoulders, loose at the waist, but he wore it as though it were armor. He stared at the floor. He did not look at me either. Oliver was not present. Victoria and I had agreed that placing a 17-year-old between his parents and his grandfather in a public courtroom would cause damage that no legal outcome could repair. Oliver waited at home. He had texted me at 7, steady hands. Judge Patricia Calloway entered at 9 sharp. She was 61, a former family law attorney herself, appointed to the probate bench 8 years ago. Victoria had researched her thoroughly. Calloway was known for 3 things. She read every document before the hearing. She despised theatrical advocacy, and she had reversed 2 conservatorship petitions in the past 3 years on grounds of insufficient evidence. She was not sympathetic by nature. She was precise. I liked her already. Holloway presented the petitioner's case first. His argument was structured around 3 pillars: my age, my isolation, following Ruth's death, and the alleged cognitive concerns identified by Dr. Prescott's evaluation. He spoke for 22 minutes. He used the phrase vulnerable elder 4 times. He referenced my diminished capacity to manage complex financial assets 3 times. He submitted Prescott's report, a 19-page document that concluded, as Jim had predicted, that certain response latencies and executive evasion markers suggested early-stage decline warranting supervised financial oversight. Prescott himself testified for 30 minutes. He was polished. He projected calm authority. He spoke about age-related cognitive trajectories and statistical norms and the gradual erosion of executive function that occurs in professionals who transition abruptly from high-demand careers to retirement. He never said I was incompetent. He said I was at risk. It was the language of probability rather than certainty. And it was more dangerous for being moderate. Victoria did not cross-examine Prescott immediately. She let his testimony sit in the room the way a surgeon lets a diagnosis settle before discussing the treatment plan. Then she stood. Dr. Prescott, you evaluated Dr. Morrison on December 9th, correct? Correct. And your report notes, on page 7, that Dr. Morrison scored in the 91st percentile on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. That is correct. Though percentile scores alone do not Page 12. Trail-making test. Part B. Dr. Morrison's completion time was 43 seconds. The age-adjusted norm for a 70-year-old male is 68 to 75 seconds. Is that accurate? It is, but page 15. Verbal fluency. Dr. Morrison produced 23 words beginning with F in 60 seconds. You noted the average for his cohort is 12 to 15. Correct? Prescott shifted. The quantitative scores are not the entirety of the assessment. No. But they are the foundation. And on that foundation, Dr. Prescott, every quantitative measure in your own report places Dr. Morrison above the 75th percentile for his age. Is that a fair summary? A pause. The quantitative results were strong. Victoria opened the second binder. I would like to submit the independent evaluation conducted by Dr. Sandra Okafor of the Medical University of South Carolina, performed on December 6th, 3 days before your evaluation. Holloway objected. Calloway overruled. Victoria handed copies to the judge, to Holloway, and placed one on the witness stand in front of Prescott. Dr. Okafor's evaluation used identical instruments. Her conclusion: Dr. Morrison's cognitive function falls in the 93rd percentile for his age cohort, with no measurable indicators of decline. Would you like to review her methodology? Prescott read for 2 minutes. The courtroom was silent except for the mechanical hum of the ventilation system. Her methodology appears standard, he said carefully. Dr. Prescott, in the last 10 years, you have been retained as the evaluating neuropsychologist in 14 conservatorship cases. In 11 of those 14, you concluded that the respondent exhibited some degree of cognitive concern. Are you aware of that pattern? Holloway objected again. Calloway paused, looked at Victoria, and said, I'll allow it. The witness may answer. Prescott's jaw tightened. Each case is evaluated independently, of course. But the court may find the pattern relevant when weighing your conclusions against Dr. Okafor's. Victoria returned to her table. She did not look at Isabel. She did not need to. The damage was structural, not dramatic. She had placed 2 datasets in front of a judge who valued evidence over emotion, and the data told a story that Prescott's careful language could not overcome. Victoria then submitted the third binder. My complete surgical record. 40 years of peer reviews. Outcomes data. The commendation from the American College of Cardiothoracic Surgeons, dated 18 months ago, and a letter from Charleston Memorial's Chief of Surgery confirming that my clinical privileges had been maintained in good standing until voluntary retirement. Judge Calloway spent 11 minutes reading. Then she removed her glasses, set them on the bench, and spoke. The court has reviewed the petition, the evaluations submitted by both parties, and the supporting documentation. The quantitative evidence before this court does not support a finding of diminished cognitive capacity. Dr. Prescott's report, while professionally prepared, relies on interpretive assessments that are contradicted by both his own quantitative data and the independent evaluation submitted by Dr. Okafor. The petition for conservatorship is denied. She struck the gavel once. The sound was small and final, like the closing of a valve. Isabel did not flinch. She gathered her handbag, whispered something to Holloway, and walked out of the courtroom without turning around. Her heels clicked on the marble hallway floor in a rhythm that sounded, to my trained ear, exactly like a resting heart rate. 60 beats per minute. Calm, controlled, already recalculating. Nathan remained seated in the gallery. He looked at me for the first time that morning. His eyes held something I could not immediately name. Not relief, not anger, not shame. Something between all three. Like a cardiac rhythm that does not fit any textbook classification. I wanted to walk to him. I wanted to sit beside my son in that wooden gallery bench and tell him that the letters, the debts, the evaluation, all of it, was not punishment. It was the only surgery I knew how to perform on a family that was dying from the inside. But this was not the moment. The infection was still active. Removing the visible symptoms did not mean the patient was cured. Victoria touched my elbow. Let's go. We walked out into December sunlight. The air was cold and clean and carried the faint salt of the harbor. I breathed it in one long, deliberate breath, the kind I took after closing a chest, when the monitors showed stable rhythm and the team exhaled together. 12 days until the patents expired. The conservatorship was dead, but Isabel's heels were still clicking somewhere ahead of me, steady and unhurried. And I knew that a woman who walks calmly out of a defeat is a woman who has not yet played her last card. In cardiac surgery, there is a condition called a tension pneumothorax, air trapped in the chest cavity, pressing against the heart, compressing it until it can no longer fill. The patient looks stable for minutes, sometimes longer, and then everything collapses at once. The treatment is immediate, a needle through the chest wall to release the pressure before the heart stops. Isabel's last card arrived 5 days before the patents expired, and it looked at first like stability. Jim Beckett called at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was already awake, standing at the kitchen window watching a cardinal land on Ruth's bird feeder, the cedar one I had built the summer she was diagnosed, when my hands needed something to do that wasn't holding her. "We found the wire," Jim said. No greeting. No preamble. Jim had spent 3 decades at the SEC, and he spoke the way SEC investigators wrote facts first, context second, pleasantries never. Marseille? Marseille. $412,000, wired in 3 tranches over the past 6 weeks from a domestic brokerage account held jointly by Nathan and Isabel Morrison. The receiving entity is a Société Civile Immobilière, a French real estate holding company registered under the name Fontaine Maritime SCI. The beneficial owner on record is Lucien Fontaine. Lucien. The name Oliver's recordings had surfaced, the voice on the other end of Isabel's French phone calls. Until this moment, he had been a shadow, a name without a shape. Now he had an address, a corporate structure, and $412,000 of my son's money sitting in a French holding company that existed for one purpose: to receive American assets, funneled through a woman who had married into my family with the patience of a surgeon and the morality of a parasite. What's the SCI holding? A property in the 7th arrondissement of Marseille. Purchased 14 months ago. Market value, approximately €600,000. The remaining balance was financed through a French lender using projected income as collateral. Projected income from what? That's the interesting part. The loan application lists anticipated royalty transfers from USW held intellectual property. Patent numbers are referenced. 3 of them are yours, Hank. I set my coffee down. The cardinal outside had not moved. It sat on the feeder with the particular stillness of a creature that does not know it is being watched. She listed my patents as collateral for a French loan, not directly. The application projects future income from patents that she anticipated would be assigned to Nathan's control through the conservatorship. She was pre-spending money she expected to steal. The audacity of it was almost clinical. Isabel had built a financial architecture that depended on a single assumption: that she would gain control of my assets before anyone noticed the scaffolding she was constructing overseas. The conservatorship was the keystone. Without it, the French loan had no projected income. Without projected income, the SCI's financing would collapse. And without the SCI, Lucien Fontaine was holding an overvalued property in Marseille with no way to service the debt. The conservatorship had been denied 7 days ago. Isabel knew the keystone was gone. Her calm exit from the courtroom now made perfect sense. She was not recalculating. She was buying time. Jim, is there enough for a criminal referral? Wire fraud. At minimum. The funds crossed state lines and international borders using a brokerage account that Nathan likely did not fully understand. Isabel controlled the transfers. Oliver's recordings confirm she managed the passwords and initiated the transactions. If federal prosecutors can establish that Nathan was unaware of the SCI structure, Isabel is the sole actor on the fraud. And Nathan is a COA account holder. He's exposed. But if he cooperates, full disclosure, voluntary testimony, a prosecutor might offer immunity in exchange for his participation. I closed my eyes. There it was, the needle through the chest wall. The moment the trapped air releases, and the heart either resumes its rhythm or it doesn't. My son's cooperation was the intervention that would determine whether Isabel's scheme resulted in a quiet financial collapse or a federal indictment. I called Victoria at 7. She answered on the first ring. "Jim found the wire," I said. "412,000 to Marseille. French SCI, under Lucien Fontaine. My patent royalties listed as projected income on a foreign loan application." Victoria was silent for 4 seconds. I had learned that Victoria's silences were proportional to the severity of the information: 1 second for routine updates, 3 for complications, 5 or more for developments that altered the entire trajectory. 4 seconds meant we were approaching the endgame. "That's wire fraud," she said. "Possibly bank fraud on the French side. And if the loan application materially misrepresented the source of income, which it did, since those patents were never assigned to Nathan, that's a separate count. Can we bring this to the U.S. Attorney's Office? I can have a referral package prepared by Thursday." Jim's transaction analysis. Oliver's recordings with certified translations, the SCI registration documents, and the loan application. But Hank, the recordings are the linchpin. A 17-year-old recorded his own mother without her knowledge. South Carolina is a one-party consent state, so the recordings are legal. But a defense attorney will attack Oliver's credibility and motive. Oliver's motive is survival. His mother was planning to leave him behind. I know. And a jury will see that. But we should prepare him. I stood at the window for a long time after we hung up. The cardinal was gone. The feeder swung gently in a wind I could not feel through the glass. 5 days until the 3 largest patents expired. Once they entered the public domain, the royalty stream that Isabel had built her entire scheme around $420,000 annually would evaporate. The French loan's projected income would become fiction. The SCI would default, and Isabel would be left standing in a collapsing structure with federal investigators reading her wire transfers. She had built her house on my patents. I was letting the foundation dissolve. That evening, Oliver came for dinner. I made Ruth's recipe shrimp and grits with the smoked paprika she had insisted on after our trip to Savannah in 2011. Oliver ate 2 plates and did not mention his parents. We talked about his college applications, his AP chemistry exam, a documentary about deep-sea engineering he had watched twice. Normal things. Human things. The kind of conversation that exists in the spaces between crises, fragile and necessary. After dinner, as he washed dishes with the careful attention he brought to everything, I told him what was coming. "The recordings you made will be part of a federal referral. Victoria will need you to meet with the prosecutors. You'll be asked to explain what you heard, when you heard it, and why you started recording." Oliver dried a plate slowly. "Will Mom go to prison?" I did not lie. "If the evidence supports the charges, and if a jury convicts, yes, that is possible." He set the plate in the cabinet. His hands were steady. Ruth's hands. The hands of someone who understands that the truth is not a weapon. It is a scalpel. It cuts cleanly only if you hold it without shaking. "I'll do it," he said. I drove him home at 9. The streets were quiet, strung with Christmas lights that cast moving reflections on the wet asphalt. At the corner of Trad Street, he opened the door, paused, and said, "Grandpa, when did you know? About Mom. When did you really know?" I thought about it honestly. "The night your grandmother died. Your mother asked about the patents before she asked about the funeral." Oliver nodded once, closed the door, and walked into the house where his mother's suitcase still sat unpacked by the stairs, 5 days away from a reckoning she had spent years believing would never come. I drove home. In the hidden office, I drew one final line on the board: read, "Solid, connecting the wire transfers to Marseille, the SCI, and the federal referral package." Below it I wrote, 5 days. Let the foundation dissolve. Ruth's watch ticked beside me. Steady as always. I wound it once, set it down, and climbed the stairs. At 12. État. M. On March 15th. 3 patents that had taken me 11 years to develop. 7 years to commercialize, and 23 years to maintain, quietly ceased to exist as private property. United States patent numbers 7,891,234 and 8,456,012 and 9,234,678, each one a piece of cardiac surgical technology I had designed at kitchen tables in hospital, cafeterias, and in the back rows of conferences where I should have been listening, but was instead sketching mechanisms on napkins entered the public domain. I was awake when it happened. Not because I planned a ceremony, but because sleep had become unreliable in those final days, arriving in fragments between 2 and 4 a.m., and then leaving without explanation. At midnight, I sat in the hidden office, Ruth's watch on the desk, the board behind me covered in red and green and black lines that mapped the architecture of a family consuming itself. The patents had generated $420,000 in annual royalties. That number would now drop to 0 for those 3. The remaining 5 patents, smaller, more specialized, less commercially valuable, would continue producing approximately $180,000 per year. Enough to live on. Enough to fund Oliver's trust. Not enough to justify the elaborate machinery Isabel had built to capture them. I had chosen not to renew. Victoria had filed the non-renewal notices 8 weeks earlier, and the Patent and Trademark Office had processed them with the bureaucratic indifference of an institution that records 10,000 such expirations every year. No flag, no inquiry. No one at the USPTO cared why a 70-year-old surgeon had decided to let his most valuable intellectual property lapse. They simply updated the database. And at 12:01 a.m., the technology that had earned me millions became available to every manufacturer, every hospital, every competitor on the planet. It was, in financial terms, an act of self-destruction. In strategic terms, it was the most precise incision I had ever made. Isabel's entire plan rested on the value of what she intended to control. The conservatorship would have given her through Nathan legal authority over my financial decisions, including the renewal and licensing of patents. The French loan application had listed projected royalty income from those 3 patents specifically. The SCI in Marseille, the property in the 7th arrondissement, the offshore architecture Lucien had constructed, all of it, was leveraged against a revenue stream that, as of 1 minute past midnight, no longer existed. I imagined the moment the French lender's compliance department would discover the change, a routine check of the collateral assumptions, a query to the USPTO database, a flag in the system, projected income source status, changed public domain. The loan would be called. The SCI would default. The property would enter foreclosure proceedings under French law, a process slower and more bureaucratic than its American equivalent, but equally terminal. Isabel would learn of the expiration soon enough. Perhaps she already knew. She was not careless, and patent renewal deadlines are public information. But knowing and understanding are different things. She knew the dates. What she had not anticipated was that I would choose to let them die. In her calculation, no rational person would surrender $420,000 a year. She had modeled my behavior on the assumption that I valued wealth the way she did as an instrument of control. She was wrong. I valued my patents the way I valued my surgical tools, for what they could do, not for what they were worth. And tonight, what they could do was disappear. I poured a glass of bourbon, the Blantons, that Ruth and I had opened on our 40th anniversary and never finished, and sat with it in the leather chair she had chosen for this room. The monitors on the desk still displayed the financial dashboard. Trust balances, remaining patent royalties, MedPioneer's acquisition timeline. The numbers glowed in the half-dark like vital signs on a bedside monitor. Oliver's trust held $412,000. Victoria had structured it to receive automatic deposits from the 5 remaining patents, $36,000 per year, compounding in a diversified portfolio managed by the corporate fiduciary. By the time Oliver turned 21, The trust would hold approximately $2 million, depending on market performance. That money was untouchable. No conservator, no court order, no scheme hatched in French over phone lines between Charleston and Marseille could reach it. MedPioneer's acquisition remained on schedule. The due diligence phase had concluded in February. Regulatory filings were under review. Victoria's latest briefing estimated a June closing within 90 days. My 20% equity stake, valued at approximately $35 million, would convert to cash or acquirer stock upon completion. I had already instructed Victoria to direct the proceeds into a charitable foundation, the Ruth Morrison Foundation for Global Cardiac Access, with Oliver named as a board trustee, and Jim Beckett as financial overseer. $35 million. I would give away nearly all of it. Not because I was generous, because money that sits in one place long enough becomes a target. And I had spent the last 5 months watching what happens when targets attract the wrong people. I drank the bourbon slowly. It was smooth and slightly sweet, the way good bourbon always is when you drink it alone in a quiet room after midnight. Ruth would have disapproved of the hour, but not the occasion. She understood endings. She had faced her own with a clarity that still humbled me, sitting in this same chair 3 weeks before she died, telling me that the only inheritance worth leaving was the kind that could not be stolen. "You were right," I said to the empty room. As usual, at 7 a.m., I called Victoria. "It's done," I said. "The patents are public domain." I confirmed with the USPTO at 6. All 3 show expired status. The royalty contracts will terminate automatically under their cessation clauses. Licensees have already been notified, and the federal referral filed yesterday. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Charleston has the package Jim's wire transfer analysis, Oliver's recordings with certified French translations, the SCI documents, and the loan application referencing your patents. I spoke with Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Kowalski. She described the evidence as substantial. Timeline: grand jury could convene within 4 to 6 weeks. If they return an indictment, arrest warrants follow immediately. I stood at the kitchen window. The March morning was already warm, Charleston shaking off winter the way it always did, suddenly and completely, as though the cold had never happened. The garden was beginning to show color again. The roses Ruth had planted were budding along the fence, small green fists that would open into red within weeks. "Victoria, there's one more thing. I want to send Nathan a letter. Not from Caduceus Recovery. From me. Personal. Handwritten." A pause. "Saying what?" "Telling him about the expiration. Explaining that the debts Caduceus holds will not be pursued to judgment if he cooperates with the federal investigation, and asking him to meet me here, at the house. Hank, that's a risk. If Isabel intercepts, Isabel is in Marseille. Oliver confirmed she left 2 days ago. Nathan is alone in that house, with debts he cannot pay, a wife who has abandoned him to protect her own exit strategy, and a father he has not spoken to in 3 months. He is running out of walls to hide behind. Victoria considered this. "I'll draft the framework. You write it in your own hand. We send it today." Today. I hung up and took Ruth's pen from the desk drawer. I sat at the kitchen table where she and I had eaten 10,000 meals, and I wrote a letter to my son. It was not long. It did not accuse. It did not forgive. It stated facts: the patents, the expiration, the debts, the federal investigation, and it ended with 5 words. "Come home. I'll be here." I sealed it, addressed it to Nathan Morrison at the house on Trad Street, and placed it on the hallway table for Victoria's courier to collect at noon. Then I went outside, knelt in the garden, and pruned the roses the way Ruth had taught me, cutting at a 45-degree angle just above the outward-facing bud, so the new growth would reach toward the light instead of back into itself. Nathan came on a Sunday. I heard the car before I saw it, the particular hesitation of an engine idling at the curb. the driver deciding whether to pull into the driveway or stay on the street, where leaving would be easier. I knew that sound. I had heard it in hospital parking lots for 40 years, the sound of someone arriving at a place they were not sure they wanted to be. I was in the kitchen making coffee. 2 cups. I had been making 2 cups every Sunday morning for a week, pouring the second one out each evening when he did not come. Ruth would have called it faith. I called it preparation. Either way, the second cup was ready. He knocked. My son, who had a key to this house, the same key he had carried since he was 16, knocked on the front door at 9:17 a.m. Like a stranger, requesting permission to enter. I opened the door. Nathan stood on the porch in jeans and a wrinkled button-down that looked pulled from a laundry basket. He had lost 15 pounds. The skin beneath his eyes carried the gray-blue tint of chronic sleeplessness. "Dad," he said. "Come in, coffee's ready." He sat in the chair that had been his since childhood, the one nearest the window, and wrapped both hands around the mug as though the warmth were the only thing holding him together. We sat in silence for 2 minutes. I did not rush him. In the operating room, the most dangerous moments are the quiet ones, the seconds after the clamp is placed, before bypass begins, when the heart is empty and waiting. You do not fill that silence. You wait for the rhythm to return on its own. "I got your letter," he said finally. "I know. Isabel is gone. She left for Marseille 9 days ago. She took 2 suitcases and the jewelry box from the bedroom safe." He paused. "She's not coming back, is she?" "No." He nodded the way a patient nods, when the diagnosis confirms what the body already knew. Then he said, "Dad, I need to tell you what happened. All of it." And he told me. Not the careful, edited version a man presents to protect himself, but the raw, unstructured way truth comes out when the walls are finally down. The gambling had started in 2019, online. Small amounts that felt like entertainment. By 2021, the amounts were no longer small. Isabel had never discouraged it. She had facilitated it, connecting him with higher or limit platforms, covering minimum payments from accounts he did not fully understand, keeping the machinery of his debt running smoothly, while she built her own architecture on top of it. The conservatorship was Isabel's idea. Raised in early 2023. Framed as concern. "Your father is alone, Nathan. He's aging. Wouldn't it be better if someone were managing his affairs?" Nathan had resisted at first, but Isabel was patient. She layered the idea with anecdotes about elderly relatives in France who had lost everything. And eventually Nathan agreed to let her hire an attorney. "I didn't know about Marseille," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know about Lucien. I signed things she put in front of me because I was drowning, and she was the only person who seemed to have a plan. I believed him. Not because his story was flawless, but because I had spent 40 years reading the difference between a patient who minimizes symptoms and a patient who has finally stopped pretending." Nathan was no longer pretending. "The debt letters," he said. "Caduceus recovery. That's you, isn't it?" "Yes." He exhaled a long, shaking breath that fogged the surface of his coffee. "How much do I owe you?" 461,000. But that number was strategic, not punitive. "If you cooperate with the federal investigation, full testimony, complete disclosure, Victoria will negotiate a settlement. The debt goes away. And if I don't, then it remains, and you face it alone. Along with whatever exposure the prosecutors determine you carry." Nathan looked around the kitchen at the counter where he had cracked eggs as a boy, at the window where Ruth's herb pot still lined the sill, at the photograph on the refrigerator of the 3 of us at Folly Beach in 2004, Nathan 12 years old, holding a sand dollar above his head like a trophy. "I want to cooperate," he said. "I'll tell them everything. Victoria will arrange a meeting with the assistant U.S. attorney this week. You'll need your own counsel separate from Holloway. Separate from anyone Isabel has contacted." "Okay." A settling silence filled the kitchen. Not the waiting silence of the operating room, but the kind that follows a successful procedure when the monitors show stable rhythm and someone exhales and says good under their breath. "Dad, The patents. You let them expire. Yes, they were worth you. Gave up. I gave up what needed to be given up. He stared at me. And I saw the question forming why. And I saw him answer it himself before the word reached his lips. Perhaps for the first time, sitting in this kitchen that smelled of coffee and cedar and the ghost of his mother's cooking, he understood that the patents were never the point. I'm sorry, Dad. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. His fingers tightened around mine with a grip that reminded me of the day he was born. The tiny hand closing around my index finger in the delivery room, holding on with a strength that seemed impossible for something so small. I know, I said. We finished our coffee. I made a second pot, and for the first time in 3 months, my son sat in my kitchen and told me about his life, not the version constructed for Isabel, not the one hidden behind debt and silence, but the real one, broken and honest and, for the first time in years, his own. Outside, the roses along the fence had opened. Red, full, reaching toward the light. The grand jury returned its indictment on a Thursday. Victoria called at 2:14 p.m. with the news, her voice carrying the controlled precision of an attorney delivering information that had been expected, but was no less heavy for its predictability. 4 counts, she said. Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Bank fraud on the French loan application. And attempted elder financial abuse under South Carolina statute. The indictment names Isabel Fontana Morrison as the sole defendant. Nathan is listed as a cooperating witness. His immunity agreement was signed yesterday. I was sitting on the garden bench when she called. The afternoon was warm. The azaleas along the fence blooming in that particular shade of pink that Charleston produces in April. Vivid, almost aggressive, as though the flowers were compensating for the mild winter. A mockingbird sat on the fence post nearest Ruth's rose bed, cycling through its borrowed repertoire. And Isabel? The U.S. Marshals have coordinated with French authorities through the MLAT Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty. She's been located at the Marseille property. The SCI is already in default on the loan, as we anticipated. The French lender filed a formal demand 3 weeks ago. Lucien Fontaine is named as a person of interest in the French proceedings, but is not currently charged. When arrest warrant is active, the marshals expect to execute within 72 hours, pending French cooperation on the extradition hold. 72 hours. In surgical terms, that was the window between diagnosis and intervention, the period when the team assembles. The instruments are prepared, and the patient is brought to the table. Except in this case, the patient did not know she was scheduled for surgery. I thanked Victoria and sat on the bench for a long time after we hung up. The mockingbird continued its performance cardinal song. Then blue jay. Then something I could not identify. Each imitation, perfect but belonging to no one. I thought about Isabel in Marseille, sitting in a property purchased with stolen projections, watching the Mediterranean from a window paid for with money that no longer existed. I wondered if she felt the floor shifting beneath her, or if she still believed the architecture would hold. Nathan called that evening. His voice sounded different. Not healed, not whole, but present in a way it had not been for years. He had met with AUSA, Diane Kowalski, twice. He had provided full testimony. The joint accounts, the documents Isabel had placed before him, the passwords she controlled, the wire transfers he had not understood. He had also disclosed the gambling, every platform, every amount, every lie. And Kowalski had noted his candor in the immunity file. She asked me when I first realized something was wrong. Nathan said. I told her the truth. I told her I knew something was wrong the day Isabel suggested the conservatorship, and I went along with it anyway because it was easier than admitting I had lost control of my own life. I listened. That was all I could offer him in this moment. Not absolution, not judgment. Just the steady presence of a father on the other end of a phone line, hearing his son speak honestly for the second time in a month. Dad, Oliver wants to see you this weekend. He has something to show you. Tell him Sunday. I'll make breakfast. The arrest happened on a Saturday. I learned of it not from Victoria or Jim, but from Oliver, who texted me at 6:42 a.m., Charleston time 12:42 p.m., in Marseille, with a link to a brief wire service report. The headline was clinical, stripped of drama. American woman arrested in Marseille on U.S. federal wire fraud charges. Extradition proceedings initiated. The article was 4 paragraphs. It identified Isabelle Fontaine Morrison, age 41, as a U.S. resident detained by French police at a residential address in the 7th arrondissement of Marseille, pursuant to a provisional arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court for the District of South Carolina. It noted that extradition proceedings would be governed by the U.S., the France bilateral treaty, and that the defendant would be held without bail pending a French magistrate's review. 4 paragraphs. That was all the world needed to summarize the end of a plan that had taken 4 years to build: the conservatorship research, the offshore wiring, the French loan, the SCI, the slow and patient campaign to dismantle an old man's autonomy and harvest the wealth beneath it. 4 paragraphs and a pair of handcuffs in a city Isabelle had chosen as her refuge. Victoria called at 8 to confirm the details. The marshals had coordinated with the police judiciaire. Isabelle had been taken from the property without incident. Lucien Fontaine was not present at the time of arrest. French investigators had seized financial documents from the residence, which would be shared with U.S. prosecutors under the MLAT framework. No bail, Victoria said. The magistrate cited flight risk. She had no ties to France, other than the property and a family connection. The extradition hearing is scheduled for May, and when she returns, she'll be arraigned in federal court in Charleston. Given the charges and the flight risk determination, I expect she'll be held pending trial. I hung up and stood at the kitchen window. The morning light fell across Ruth's herb pots, on the sill basil, rosemary, thyme plants. I had maintained not because I cooked with them often, but because their smell reminded me of her hands after an afternoon in the garden. I touched the rosemary. The oils clung to my fingertips, the way certain memories cling to the mind. Persistent, involuntary, activated by contact. Oliver arrived Sunday morning with a laptop bag over his shoulder and a box of pastries from the bakery on King Street. He set both on the kitchen table, poured himself coffee without asking, he had earned that right, and opened the laptop. I got in, he said. On the screen was an email from the Johns Hopkins University Prep Medical Scholars Program. Oliver had been accepted into a summer research fellowship in biomedical engineering, full funding, beginning in June. The program was competitive. 40 positions from over 2,000 applicants, and Oliver's application had included a personal essay about growing up in a household where medicine was discussed at every dinner table, and B.S. silence was the loudest language spoken. I read the email twice. Then I closed the laptop, looked at my grandson, and said, "Your grandmother would have cried." "I know," Oliver said. "That's why I brought pastries instead of tissues." I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in months, a real laugh. The kind that starts in the chest and rises without permission. Oliver smiled, and in his smile I saw Ruth so clearly that for a moment the kitchen felt full again. The way it had been when she was alive, and every Sunday morning was an ordinary miracle. We ate pastries and drank coffee, and talked about Hopkins and biomedical engineering and the future. Not the future I had spent 5 months defending against theft, but the future as it was meant to be discussed with excitement, with curiosity, with the quiet confidence of people who had survived something and were still standing. Ruth's watch sat on the counter where I had left it the night before. It ticked steadily, counting seconds that no longer felt like a countdown. The Med Pioneer acquisition closed on a Tuesday in June, 3 days after Oliver left for Baltimore. I drove him to the airport myself. He carried 1 suitcase, a backpack filled with textbooks he had already begun annotating, and a small wooden box I had given him the night before. Inside the box was Ruth's pocket watch. The silver one, engraved steady hands. Steady heart, wrapped in the same velvet cloth she had used when she first presented it to me on our wedding night, 43 years ago. "I can't take this," Oliver had said, turning it over in his hands. "You're not taking it. You're carrying it forward." He held it the way I had taught him to hold a surgical instrument during our kitchen table anatomy lessons, firm enough to control, gentle enough not to damage. He understood. He had always understood. At the airport gate, he hugged me, not the brief, obligatory embrace of a teenager performing a social ritual, but the long, deliberate hold of a young man who knows that the person he is leaving has given him something that cannot be measured in patents or trust accounts or university fellowships. I held him back. I memorized the pressure of his arms, the height of his shoulder against my chin, the smell of the cedar soap Ruth had kept in every bathroom, and that Oliver had quietly continued buying after she died. "Call me when you land," I said. "I will. And Oliver, the watch needs winding every 48 hours. Don't forget." He smiled. Steady hands. Steady heart. "I want you to see the sis, that's the reserve." That pack slightly too large for his frame, his stride already carrying the purposeful rhythm of someone moving towards something rather than away. Then he was gone, swallowed by the corridor, and I stood alone in the terminal lobby with the particular emptiness that follows every departure, not grief, not loss, but the awareness that a space has opened where a presence used to be. 3 days later, Victoria called with the final numbers. The acquisition had been completed at a valuation that exceeded projections. MedPioneer's technology portfolio, including the cardiac monitoring platform I had co-developed with 3 former residents in 2012, had attracted competitive interest from 2 additional bidders during the regulatory review period, driving the final price above initial estimates. My 20% equity stake converted to $37.4 million, net of fees and tax obligations. I signed the transfer documents in Victoria's office on Broad Street. Every dollar, all $37.4 million, was directed into the Ruth Morrison Foundation for Global Cardiac Access, a 501(c)(3) charitable organization established 11 weeks earlier, with a 3-person board, myself as founding director, Jim Beckett as financial trustee, and Oliver Morrison as the youngest board member in the foundation's charter. The foundation's mission was simple. Ruth had written it herself, in a notebook I found in her bedside drawer 6 months after she died, between a grocery list and a reminder to water the ferns. "Everyone deserves a surgeon who shows up." I had those words engraved on the foundation's letterhead, and I intended to spend whatever years remained to me making them true. The first grant, $3.2 million, funded a cardiac surgical training center in Accra, Ghana, partnered with the University of Ghana Medical School. The second, $2.8 million, established a rotating fellowship that would bring surgeons from underserved regions to Charleston Memorial for 12-month advanced training residencies. The third, $1.5 million, created a mobile surgical unit designed for rural communities in the American South, where the nearest cardiac center was more than 100 miles away. Victoria asked me, the day I signed, whether I had any reservations about giving away $37 million. "I kept the house," I said. "I kept the garden. I kept 5 patents that generate enough to live on. And I kept a grandson who winds a pocket watch every 48 hours. What exactly would I be reserving the money for?" She did not argue. She had learned, over 5 months of navigating the most complicated case of her career, that I made decisions the way I performed surgery completely, without partial commitment, and with the understanding that hesitation costs more than boldness. Nathan was present at the signing. He sat in a chair by the window of Victoria's office, quieter than I had ever known him, wearing a clean shirt and a face that had begun to regain its color. He had entered a treatment program for gambling addiction in April, voluntary, residential, 30 days, followed by outpatient counseling. He attended meetings 3 times a week. He had sold the house on Trad Street and moved into a small apartment on James Island, close enough to visit but far enough to build something that was his own. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked if he could volunteer at the Foundation's mobile surgical unit when it launched in the fall. I said yes. It was not a grand reconciliation. Ubble, 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 ubbly, ubble, ubbly, ubble, ubbly. It was a beginning. The kind that starts with small, repeated actions rather than a single dramatic gesture. A surgeon understands this. Healing is not an event. It is a process measured in days and discipline, and the willingness to show up even when the outcome is uncertain. Isabel's trial was scheduled for September. She had been extradited in May, arraigned in federal court in Charleston, and held without bail. Nathan would testify. Oliver would provide his recordings and translations. Victoria estimated the proceedings would last 2 weeks. I did not attend the arraignment. I would not attend the trial. I had built the case, assembled the evidence, and handed it to the system. The rest belonged to the courtroom, not to me. On a Sunday evening in late June, I sat on the garden bench with a cup of Earl Grey and watched the light change over the rooftops of Magnolia Street. The roses were in full bloom, 37 bushes Ruth had planted over 20 years, each one chosen for a specific memory. The red climber by the gate was our anniversary. The white floribunda near the porch was Oliver's birth. The yellow grandiflora at the far corner, the one that bloomed later than all the others, was the day I came home from my first solo cardiac surgery and found Ruth waiting on this bench with a bottle of champagne and a card that read, "You showed up." My phone buzzed. A text from Oliver, sent from a lab bench at Johns Hopkins at 9:47 p.m. because my grandson kept the same hours I once kept late. Focused, driven by the quiet compulsion of someone who has found the thing they were meant to do. Grandpa. First week done. The watch is wound. The hands are steady. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down, picked up my tea, and sat in the garden Ruth had built. In the house we had shared, on the street where I had lived long enough to learn that the most valuable things a man can own are the ones that cannot be taken. Not by conservatorships, not by offshore accounts, not by the patient cruelty of people who mistake wealth for worth. The evening settled around me. Somewhere in Baltimore, a 17-year-old boy was winding a silver watch. Somewhere on James Island, my son was attending a meeting and learning, one day at a time, how to stand without walls. And here on Magnolia Street, an old surgeon sat among the roses, hands finally still, heart finally steady, listening to the silence and finding it, for the first time in a very long time, enough.